We might wait a couple of minutes to let people filter into the room. Well, I think in the interest of time, maybe I will just go ahead and start. So hello and welcome to our webinar on religion and the future of democracy. I'm Molly Laas, the director of the Religion in the Public Sphere program at the Social Science Research Council. So we are here today for two purposes. One is to listen to Dr. Bhanu Mehta, Dr. Buckley, and Dr. Deckman speak about the role of religion in contemporary democracies around the globe. But before I hand the floor to them, I'd like to take the opportunity to introduce a new platform for religion and international affairs that we are launching today. So Intersections is a digital platform that curates scholarly research at the convergence of religion and international affairs. Its mission is to act as a resource for researchers, policymakers, media professionals, and the wider public by highlighting scholarship on the changing role of religion in the world. By doing so, we hope to promote broader understandings of religion in public life across the globe and recognize the critical impacts of religious beliefs and practices on discourse and policy. The platform is a free resource that the Social Science Research Council has developed, leveraging the infrastructure of SSRC's Research Area Mapping Platform Initiative, which you can learn about more on our website. The project is generously sponsored by the Henry Luce Foundation. And as I continue to thank people, I'd also like to thank Ajlai Basu, who's the program officer for RPS, and Therese Arki, who is the program associate for RPS, for all of their work in putting together this website. Please do check it out. It's a very great resource. So thank you very much to both the Luce Foundation and to Ajlai and Therese. So a major role of Intersections is to serve as an accessible repository of 16 years of research on the role of religion in global affairs that was sponsored by the Luce Foundation. The Henry R. Luce Initiative on Religion and International Affairs launched in 2005, and it introduced an essential shift in scholarship and public discourse by acknowledging the significant influence of religion on foreign policy and global matters. Over its tenure, the initiative awarded 223 grants to academic, public policy, and media organizations. So many of these outputs are currently on the Intersections site. You can find them under the Projects tab on the Intersections homepage. Here you can see a glimpse of a project that actually Dr. Bhanu Mehta worked on. It was a special issue of the Journal of the Studies in Indian Politics on religious populism and the future of democracy. But we also invite you to take a look at all of the other projects available on the site. So HRLI sponsored workshops, documentaries, photo essays, online resources, and podcasts, among other things. So SSRC wrote overviews of all of these projects and put links to them on the website, so you can click through and see the full project, including YouTube links to documentaries and other resources. So it is our intention that having the HRLI grants collected on Intersections will preserve this important work and allow it to reach new audiences. These outputs are browsable by type and by contributor, so it's possible to get a great overview of the kinds of work that HRLI supported and benefit from learning about the important ideas and insights generated by these grantees. At the same time, Intersections will be more than just an archive of this work. We have been using the technical capacities of the Research AMP platform to build out some features for this site that will allow us to create new content that will capture the insights of this growing field. We've organized this content into 4 research topics: climate futures, religion and democracy, religion in the digital age, and policy focus. The research topics structure the extant content, but are primarily designed to categorize new work that we'll be publishing over the next year. For example, we have published literature reviews, what we call field reviews, for each of our research topics. The intent with the field reviews is to create an overview of the field as a whole and provide an accessible way into this research topic. So you can take a look at them. They've got an overview of the research topic and links to citations, so you can kind of build out your understanding of this field. And these field reviews make use of an additional special feature of the Intersections site, which is a public Zotero library integrated into it. The library contains a body of scholarly work that relates to the research topic. So if you click a citation in a field review, you gain access to all this other work and can make broader connections in the field. And a final feature I'd like to draw your attention to is our profiles section. Here is where we have a list of profiles of the HRLI grantees, which is an opportunity to show their biographies, the work they've contributed to both HRLI and to the intersection site, and to have their contact information in case you might want to ask them further questions or to get in touch with them to collaborate. So this is a quick way to get access to the vast body of expertise brought together by the grant program, and we will continue to update the profiles section as we build connections with more scholars working in the field. So what I'd like to underscore by drawing your attention to these different parts of the Intersections website is that our aim here is not just to uplift the HRLI body of work, but also to link it in a very direct way to the wider field of religion and international affairs. You may come to the Intersections site wanting to know more about a particular HRLI grant, but through the links and connections we've built into the site, you can see other work on the topic or other work by the grantees, and in this way gain access to more information than you would just by looking at a single page on the site. So I will also say that we are planning essay series in the coming year on religion, civic engagement, and democratic renewal, religion and energy, and religion and agency in an age of digital mediation and AI. We will likely start publishing these essays in the summer, so please do watch this space. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our distinguished panelists. So Dr. Pratap Bhanu Mehta is the Lawrence J. Rockefeller Visiting Professor for Distinguished Teaching at Princeton University. He was previously Vice Chancellor of Ashoka University and President of the Center for Policy Research in Delhi. He has published widely in political theory, history of ideas, Indian constitutional law, and politics in India. He is the author of The Burden of Democracy, which came out from Penguin in 2003, and he has produced several edited volumes. His forthcoming work looks at philosophical ideas about religion in 20th century India. Dr. Bhanu Mehta is also a fellow of the British Academy and was a Social Science Research Council fellow in 2020. Dr. David Buckley is an associate professor of political science and the Paul Weber Endowed Chair in Politics, Science, and Religion at the University of Louisville, where he serves as the director of the Center for Asian Democracy. Dr. Buckley is currently finalizing 2 book manuscripts. The first, Blessing America First, Religion, Populism, and Foreign Policy in the Trump Administration, which is forthcoming from Columbia University Press, documents how the Trump administration's populism changed the place of religion in U.S. foreign policy bureaucracy. The second, with Stephen Brooke, traces the role of grassroots religious institutions in protecting communities from the intense violence associated with Rodrigo Duterte's drug war in the Philippines. Dr. Buckley was a Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellow in 2016 through 2017, serving as a senior advisor in the State Department Secretary's Office of Religion and Global Affairs. His research focuses on the comparative relationship between religion and democracy, and Dr. Buckley was also a dissertation fellow at the SSRC. Last but not least is our moderator, Dr. Melissa Deckman, who is the CEO of PRRI and a political scientist who studies the impact of gender, religion, and age on public opinion and political behavior. Prior to joining PRRI, Deckman served as the Louis L. Goldstein Professor of Public Affairs and Chair of the Political Science Department at Washington College. Dr. Deckman is the author of Tea Party Women, which came out from NYU Press in 2016, which examined the role of women in conservative politics. Columbia University Press will publish her latest book, The Politics of Gen Z, How the Youngest Voters Will Shape Our Democracy, this September. And Dr. Deckman's commentary and research about politics has appeared in the New York Times, CNN, MSNBC, The Washington Post, among other outlets. And I think I don't want to take too much more time before we can get straight to the conversation. So I will thank you all again and pass it to Dr. Deckman.
Thank you so much, Molly, for that wonderful introduction, for inviting me here. I'm really looking forward to this conversation this morning. Congratulations also to the SSRC team and its launch of Intersections. It's a beautiful website. I encourage everyone to please take a look at it. It's a wonderful resource for scholars who study religion, democracy, and a variety of areas where religion has an important facet to helping us understand trends in society. So I wanted to actually give you all the lay of the land a bit with respect to an overview of where this conversation is going to go. This year, of course, 2024 is a critical one for the future of democracy. As a political scientist, I can tell you, that the growing threats of authoritarianism, nationalism, polarization have never been more fraught. And religion certainly, I think, plays an important part of those trends that we're seeing both here in the US and abroad. And so today, we're going to take a deeper dive into the role that religion plays in both hindering democracy, but also perhaps fostering democracy as well, by focusing in on the research of Pratap and David more specifically, and including some data that we have collected here at Public Religion Research Institute on Christian nationalism in particular. So we're going to talk about those two threads. We're also going to talk about avenues that might be fruitful for research for scholars who are interested in how religion intersects with democracy. And if time permits, hopefully we'll have a chance to answer some questions that we invite you to ask on the Q&A feature of the Zoom link here. However, I think we're going to first start with a discussion of the concept of religion, specifically how the historical transformation of ideas about religion are speaking to the current moment and the challenges we're seeing here and abroad with respect to democracy. And so to get us kicked off, I'd actually want to have Pratap maybe start to talk a bit about how he sees sort of changing ideas about religion, the nature of religious authority, all of those sorts of things interacting with our concerns about democracy today. And then we'll hear from David.
Thank you. Intersections for this great honor and opportunity, and it's a privilege and frankly a little intimidating to be amongst such distinguished panelists and the audience. So what I thought I'd do is maybe spend 3 or 4 minutes setting some historical context for this contemporary discussion about religion and politics. And one way of doing it is to ask the following question, rather than just define religion. I mean, definitions, only ahistorical things can be defined, as Nietzsche once said, is to ask the question, what functions does religion perform in our politics, and how do we look at those functions in a kind of, over a kind of long arc of history, maybe the last 300 to 400 years, right? And I want to make 3 points, essentially, one about the state, one about democracy, and one about, in a sense, the moral psychology of religion. So the point about state and religion is going to be very simple, obvious to probably most in this audience. If we ask the question, how do we distinguish or draw the line between the religious and the non-religious, or what we think the antonyms of religion are? I mean, in the ancient world, religion was contrasted with superstition, for example. That was one of the principal antonyms in somebody like Lactantius. The answer to these questions is not at all actually obvious. We often think of religion and the secular, or whatever its opposite or its other is meant to be, as already pre-constituted spheres. And then the political question is, what's the relationship between them? Our principal metaphor of talking about it, right? What is the relationship between church and state? Sometimes gives this impression there is something called the state, and then there is something called the church, and then what is the appropriate relationship between them, right? But the fact of the matter is that the line between the religion and the secular, or the religion and whatever that other is that by which you want to characterize this kind of outside of religion, in the modern world has almost always been drawn by sovereign power itself. The distinction between the religious and the secular is actually itself a function of the rise of sovereign power and where that sovereign power chooses to actually draw that line. So even when we say separation of church and state, the terms of that separation, right? What does properly belong to the state and what does properly belong to the church or religion are actually set by the state. And in the modern world, and this is why I think this conflict is kind of endemic, the demands that the state places on its citizens inevitably expand, right? The state wants to combat religion as a form of social power, because religion as a form of social power sometimes traps individuals within religion under conditions of unfreedom. And how much unfreedom of individuals a state will tolerate will in part depend on how much a state thinks a religion actually structures the civic standing of citizens. So, for example, in India, there's recently a very big case where there's a temple where menstruating women are not allowed entry at certain points during the year. And the Indian Supreme Court decided that this practice actually impugned not just equality of women sort of in terms of religious practice, but actually impugned their civic standing and thought it fit to intervene in this case. So that's just one example, right, in some ways. So at one level, I think the fundamental question of a modern society, what are the terms in which citizens relate to each other, will always mean that there will be a conversation between religion and the state. And as Dr. Buckley's wonderful research has shown us, there are different models of thinking about that conversation. I think the second one, which is more, I think, consequential, at least in contemporary India, has to do with the transformation of religion into nationalism. So there is a particular challenge that arises internal to democracy. And the challenge is the following: a democracy requires a demos, some conception of the people. And historically, almost all societies have had to debate this question: who gets to be a member of this demos, right? And historically, frankly, a lot of these questions were decided on ethnic criteria, on majoritarian criteria. I mean, think of the exclusions of Catholics and Jews in 18th, 19th century England. There's a whole range of exclusions built into the constitution for demos. Now, in the modern world, as it happens in many societies, right, there is an attempt to argue that the fundamental identity of the demos has to be constituted by some form of identity. And the form of identity that is readily available, or at least sought to be mobilized, happens to be, in a sense, a religious identity. But it's a religious identity in a very peculiar sense. It's not a religious identity that's concerned with, soteriology, eschatology, belief, perhaps even conceptions of justice. It's simply membership in a particular religious group, where that religious group is understood as a kind of ethnic identity. So think of Hindu nationalism, for example. Think of Zionism as example, the two paradigmatic examples in some senses of the transformation of religious identities into a form of ethnicity that is then mobilized in the service of nationalism. And some of the biggest conflicts that we are seeing around the world are around the mobilizations of these kinds of ethnic identities. These ethnic identities have a deep connection to democracy, because in democracy, demography becomes very important, right? I mean, unlike in many other political systems, democracy is a numbers game. And in the process of institutionalizing democracy, particularly in societies that are diverse, the natural question arises: what if there are majorities and minorities, religious majorities and religious minorities, right? What forms of power sharing will be appropriate under conditions where you have these kinds of majorities and minorities, right? And so a lot of the conflicts, again, one can think of modern India, is actually structured around this question of what is the appropriate kind of representation that allows power sharing between religious communities. And Hindu nationalism, basically, to sort of give a one-line summary, basically says India is actually a Hindu nation. The idea of who a Hindu is defined by kinship and blood relationship, a kind of form of ethnic identification. And it says that the dominant identity of India, understood in terms of its history, in terms of who gets to be a legitimate member, whose cultural representations are privileged, will be largely Hindu. And that, of course, generates kind of conflicts of all kinds. And the third and final one, which is something which is kind of internal to religion itself, which is all religions, as we know, have historically been internally contested. And one of the things I think we experience in the modern world is a kind of internal crisis of religious authority. Every religion has gone through its own kind of Protestant revolution, as it were. By Protestant, I just mean of splintering of authority within religious structures of different kinds, right? And often the state is actually asked to adjudicate intra-religious competition. Often the state is brought in because in the process of this intra-religious competition, a very simple question arises. How do religions benchmark their identity? What is it to be a Hindu? What is it to be a Muslim? Sometimes what is it to be a Christian? Or Jew, or you can kind of fill in the blanks. And that process of benchmarking, right? Is the benchmarking a particular belief, a particular practice? That process of benchmarking produces certain kinds of exclusions, in some cases, the demands for, let's say, blasphemy laws. And the state is always asked to adjudicate, therefore, the identities of religions in actually very, very, very particular ways. And I think you're seeing in democratic politics, actually mobilization around all three of these questions.
Thank you, Pratap. I actually want to turn the mic over now to David for some of his thoughts about changing conceptions of religion and what it is helping us, how it helps us understand threats that we're facing in terms of democracy.
Yeah, well, maybe I'll just pick up on the last point that Pratap actually put on the agenda for a couple of minutes and then let us move forward. This question of religious authority, right, and how it's changing in the contemporary period. I mean, I think that we've learned so much across the social sciences and religious studies about the complexity of religious authority, contestation between different spheres, particularly kind of how the grassroots, more lived religion perspective might interact with more hierarchical approaches to the study of religious authority. And, the SSRC has been involved in supporting a lot of that work. I think we've made a lot of progress there. One area where I see, some potential for really interesting future research that I know has started is how some of the contemporary challenges to democracy might kind of endogenously be changing the nature of religious authority in certain contexts. And to give just one example of that, I'll talk briefly about some research that co-authors and I did recently on Christian nationalism and support for violence, right? We found kind of maybe unsurprisingly, in light of a lot of the other research that's out there, that there is kind of an overall relationship in public opinion between Christian nationalism and support for forms of political violence. But actually, what we found when we pushed a little harder is that this relationship really only exists when Christian nationalism is combined with other forms of kind of conspiratorial or victimhood politics that we see growing in the American context in different sectors, but especially on kind of new sectors of the right. And to me, this raises questions about how kind of traditional conceptions of clerical religious authority might be intersecting with newer trends in religious political authority tied to disinformation, tied to conspiratorial thinking, tied to perceived victimhood that are present in traditional congregations, sure, but as I think many of us are aware, are perhaps most present and most actively being generated on social media through digital communications tools of different kinds, right? And so I think a major task for those of us who are interested in the relationship between religion and democracy moving forward is trying to continue to wrestle around with how the current challenges facing democracy might also be kind of at the same time redefining the nature of religious authority within domestic contexts, right, nationally, but also transnationally, as we can talk about a little more later.
Yeah, let's definitely pick up on that theme a little bit later in the context of Christian nationalism. I think that links to conspiratorial thinking, to disinformation, to the role of political and religious elites, and also fomenting some of these ideas and concerns and challenges is really important to bear in mind. I want to return, though, to a larger conversation about the role of religion in hindering democracy. And I think here Pratap's work clearly on the threat that Hindu nationalism poses to democracy, and really what I think heretofore had been viewed as maybe a modern success story in terms of democracy, of having a pluralistic democracy with multiple faiths represented and its inhabitants being active in the demos, to use your term, Pratap. So what can you tell us about your research in terms of the threat that Hindu nationalism is posing in terms of trying to dial back some of the democracy and constitutional protections within India?
So a couple of things, and picking up on David's point about victimhood, which is actually very central to this conversation, right? Which is religion becomes a threat, or religious groups become a threat to democracy when they deeply internalize some kind of narrative of victimhood, for the most part, right? But this sense of victimhood has many different sources. Sometimes it's a legitimate sense. I mean, minorities can sometimes be genuinely victimized, right? But there are two structural features that are actually leading a lot of Hindu groups and a lot of Hindu organizations to be almost in a permanent state of victimhood. One structural feature, which I think is common to a lot of our democracies, is this kind of strange demographic anxiety, right? That even majority religions have, that somehow they will, in a sense, be overrun demographically by members of other religions and other groups. And it can actually sometimes takes very, very concrete forms. Great replacement theory in India debates over, for example, decline of fertility rates. And a lot of the agenda of Hindu nationalism is, in a sense, actually stems from this demographic kind of anxiety. But there's a second aspect of this victimhood, which I think is more complicated, I think, and again, may lend itself to kind of comparative analysis, which is, it is the case that in the modern world, right, more and more of our lives are effectively structured by secular institutions, right? So even Hindus now, hopefully, thankfully, will not argue, let's reinstitute a kind of ancient Hindu division of labor, or let's restructure India's economy on some kind of, traditional Hindu lines, right? And what that does is that it often gives the sense to believers that the domains over which they are exercising sovereignty are actually shrinking, right? There's almost, almost like a Protestantization of religion, right? That it's kind of being confined to belief or private practice or limited forms of public expression, but it really can't, in a sense, structure large parts of your kind of public life, right? And I think that structural feature sometimes leads religious groups to believe that they are under a kind of permanent assault from something called secularism, from something called modernity, right? And as I said, this is a permanent structural feature, because I think these are, in a sense, deep undercurrents about the nature of the modern state, the nature of the modern economy. Now, what Hindu nationalism does effectively is it draws on these two currents and then adds a third one, which is what gives its anti-democratic potential such virulence, which is, it basically argues that India was partitioned in 1947. That partition was, in some senses, a failure of secular nationalism. The Congress Party's kind of dream of, in a sense, creating a multi-religious India, where all religions could live on equal terms and also protect individual freedom. And essentially what it wants to do is it wants to complete the logic of 1947 and say that in 1947, despite the fact that India was divided, the creation of a Muslim homeland in Pakistan and India still chose to be a secular, liberal, representative constitution, right? And in that sense, at the core of Hindu nationalism is actually a deep resentment and hatred of Muslim minorities. Partly those minorities are seen as, historically, as responsible for the partition of India. And partly, right, in a sense, Hindu nationalism wants to mimic the logic of that partition by saying that if you actually did that partition and ethnic lines, let's follow it to its logical conclusion, that if Pakistan is a Muslim state, India needs to be a Hindu nation. And the model they draw, and I think this is the important point to underscore, is 19th century European nationalism. Their argument is that almost every 19th century state in Europe that emerged after the dissolution of the Habsburg Empire, the states that emerged after the dissolution of the Ottoman empires, each of those states had some kind of majoritarian ethnic identity at the core, right, in some senses. And that India, in some senses, should follow that path. And by not following that path, by trying to create this incredibly innovative experiment of multi-religious accommodation, India has actually weakened both its power And it has actually failed to give Hindus their due as the majority in the nation.
Thank you, Pratap. David, did you have a response to Pratap's comments, or maybe you want to just share more of your thoughts from your own research, say in the Philippines,
Yeah, well,
where,
no, just
this might fit into this conversation.
Yeah, I mean, again, just briefly, I think it's important to note that what Pratap just described in the Indian context is something that we're seeing on a kind of comparative basis, right? And not only does this seem to be bubbling up in isolated cases, right, but there's evidence that there is kind of transnational learning, right, going on in some of these, whether you want to call them illiberal religious nationalists or religious populists or whatever term you want to use. That there's a kind of, it's too strong to say that this is maybe a set network, but there's clearly diffusion of some of these ideas of kind of religious, ethnic, national homogeneity bringing strength and the need to push back against transnational attempts to limit our cohesion as a political community, right? You can see this relationally, right, in ties between Christian nationalists in the United States and those in places like Bolsonaro's Brazil, right, or Orbán's Hungary. But it's not just sort of Christians talking to each other internationally, right? I mean, we've seen some of these interesting ties involving some in the Hindu nationalist movement even. And certainly the relationship between Orbán and the Israeli government, one that he cultivates, right, in sort of defense of religious freedom while also identifying as a religious nationalist and an illiberal Democrat, right? So I think there's just a lot of work to be done in tracing those international dynamics as well. I know that Peter Mandeville and co-authors have started to look at some of that, and then I think that's a very fruitful international area for future research too.
Wonderful. We'll speak a little bit more about how this is manifesting perhaps in the US context in just a few minutes, but I want to actually shift the focus a bit to thinking about how religion can foster democracy. I think there are lots of examples in the US context, I think about with respect to going back to the Tocquevillian argument about churches being vital for fostering civic engagement and participatory elements in the 19th century. But I want to turn to David's work too, because I think your work on the role of the Catholic Church in particular in the Philippines has really been fascinating and reminds us that religion, moral authority can be used in ways that in fact buttress or support democracy. So maybe you could share a little bit about some of your findings with respect to how religion can foster democracy in the Filipino context.
Sure. Yeah, happy to. Yeah, the Philippines is such an interesting place to study religion and democracy because at a fundamental level, if the audience knows one thing about religion and Philippine democracy, it's probably the kind of mythology of the 1986 People Power Revolution, right? When the churches, especially the Catholic Church, but not only the Catholic Church, played a part in bringing hundreds of thousands of Filipinos into the streets to more or less peacefully bring down the Marcos dictatorship and restore democracy, right? One of the poster children of third wave democracy. There's a lot of evidence of that, right? It was a very interesting period, but I think that the question in the last decade or so has been, can religious institutions still play this role, and to what extent is this possible? Religious influence, and again, particularly the Catholic Church's influence, was called into question actually in the decades after the People Power Revolution. Probably the most prominent example of this was a piece of legislation that was eventually pushed through in 2013 that came to be known as the Reproductive Health Law. This was a law that was pushed through by President Aquino, right, the inheritor of the legacy of Cory Aquino in the People Power period, but against the wishes of the Catholic hierarchy in the country, right? And so at the time, there was a lot of questions. Does this mean that religion's influence in Philippine politics is kind of broken, and that nobody needs to be afraid of the big bad Catholic Church anymore, right? This came to another level with the campaign of eventual President Rodrigo Duterte in 2015 and 2016. Probably most famously, while on the campaign trail, Duterte cursed Pope Francis, right, for causing traffic during his visits to the country. You might think, well, how could this possibly be the case? Was this political suicide, right? But no, Duterte, ever the populist, had a very keen sense that his kind of rhetoric here would be perceived as anti-elite, right, and critical of those who take advantage of the broader people for their own benefit. Duterte comes into office, of course, and brings real threats to democracy and human rights in the country. And so what I, working especially with co-author Stephen Brooke, have been trying to do is to look at what capacity, if any, religious institutions might have had to stabilize democratic institutions during this period. And to kind of overall sum up the argument that we're going to be making in the book, is that the model of 1986 doesn't appear to be on the table anymore. In other words, there were national level statements, right? Critical of Duterte, critical of human rights abuses from different religious leaders. And yet Duterte exited office with his popularity still overwhelmingly intact, right? And the popularity of his drug war, the kind of cornerstone policy of his administration, still relatively robust, right? As far as we can tell in public opinion data. But at the same time, there's actually pretty extensive evidence that at the local level, at the grassroots level, religious institutions and the committed actors within those institutions were able to offer at least a measure of community protection from the localized dynamics of violence in the case. You know, there's a couple of ways we can think about this. One is just that the infrastructure, the guts of organized religion in the country remains more present than most social sectors in the communities most subject to violence, in the urban poor communities where violence was most intense. Right? And also the moral authority of religious leaders in those communities was perceived to be significantly higher than the authority maybe of secular human rights groups, right, who perceived themselves as actually lacking the deep community ties in those neighborhoods that they needed to operate on their own. It's also a story that foregrounds the complexity of religious authority. We find, of course, sort of male clerics playing a very important role in this, given the Catholic context, but also religious sisters, right, from women's religious orders, as well as just average Filipinos, particularly widows left behind by the violence, as eventually becoming extremely important, not just as a target of charity, but actually as a source of community reconstruction and maybe even accountability efforts, right, in their empowerment. So it's an ambiguous case. On the one hand, there has been very limited accountability for any of this violence. The health of democratic institutions in the country is still really under question, right? But at the same time, I think that the counterfactual, if the Philippines had not had this kind of agency exercised on the part of some local religious actors, is that actually democracy would be in even worse shape, right? And there would have been more violence. The health of institutions would be even weaker. It's not an easy triumph story, but I do think that it's one of continued importance of religion's role in stabilizing institutions in tough times.
Thank you. Pratap, I'm just kind of curious, this wasn't on our run of show, but thinking about the ways that religion can be used to foster democracy, is there any indication in India of groups that are working on a more pluralistic religious, you know, in a pluralistic way, where they're trying to essentially reach out to other groups and to kind of foster a more multi-religious, you know, attempt to impact, you know, elections or democratic aims, that sort of thing? I know there's in the US example, of course, there's a long history of that sort of interreligious, pluralistic idea, but is there any sense that that's happening in India, or is it really being actively suppressed?
So this is, I think, the kind of the worry about modern India, right? Because at one level, that the phenomena that you described, right, which is the structure of religious activity, if not the intention of religious actors themselves, right? Historically, actually, India has been pretty supportive of democracy, at least in three ways. One, the internal pluralism of religions. So enough cross-cutting cleavages, enough internal denominational freedoms, right? In a sense, both allow the creation of particular kinds of social capital, but they allow a kind of, you know, attune people to diversity in some ways, right? And that was historically one of the arguments made about Hinduism, at least the way it kind of functioned in democracies, right? The second was a kind of a dominant strain of Hinduism, you know, associated even in the national movement with figures like Gandhi, but actually much more widespread, or older forms of organization like Ramakrishna Mission, Swami Vivekananda and stuff. But there was a clear kind of ideological commitment in some senses, both to at least a certain kind of religious toleration. In fact, the claim was that the distinctiveness of the civilization is actually going to be toleration. I mean, so you can argue about that claim, but that aspiration was actually very self-consciously central to their kind of ideological identity. I think in some ways. And the third, I think, interesting thing, and particularly in the case of Hinduism, which is precisely because it has no single book, no single overarching hierarchical structure historically, is that in some senses the way then questions of how to reform Hindu religion and so forth were settled were actually democratically, I mean, through the aegis of electoral politics and in the Indian parliament in the Indian state. So the Indian story actually was predominantly that it wasn't a question of individual groups being committed to democracy, but just the structural and institutional context actually made them very propitious for democracy. What we are seeing right now, and this is actually unprecedented, I mean, I sometimes say Hindu nationalism is the first real colonization of Hinduism, is you have this phenomenon going in reverse. You have the ideological centrality of Hindu nationalism. And the core of that ideological centrality is the glorification of power and violence. In fact, their entire theodicy of religion is that Hindus have been victimized for thousands of years precisely because they embraced, these nonsensical ideologies like Buddhism and Gandhism and all this kind of peace-loving stuff. So the centrality and legitimation of violence as an instrument is actually relatively new, and there are groups working against that. But I think it has to be said with some alarm that the balance has shifted. I think the second thing which this particular government has managed to do, and it's again quite a remarkable phenomenon, is that it has actually managed to align a lot of disparate cross-cutting Hindu denominations into one overarching political structure. So when Prime Minister Modi, for example, inaugurated the Ram Temple, I mean, it was also meant to be a show of Hindu unity in some ways. And I think one thread you're seeing in religious politics across the world is previously religious denominations used to take pride in defining themselves against the state, right? That this is a domain in which the state should not interfere. Now religious denominations want to increase their power using state power. So you're seeing that with the church in Hungary, you're seeing that in Russia. That's a new phenomenon. It's a kind of reversal of that traditional denominational suspicion that I think Hindu groups in some senses had, had of the state. And I think the third thing, which I think is, again, unprecedented, is that I have to say, at least in my lifetime, I have not seen the kind of dissemination of hate against minorities, particularly Muslims, as being normalized, not just amongst religious circles, but this kind of strange overlap between kind of religion and nationalism. So in some senses, what's happening in India right now is actually going against the grain of a lot of its 20th century trajectory. I mean, these tendencies were always there, but in some senses, they were considered, in a sense, the subordinate clause in the modern Indian story, not the main clause.
Yeah, I think that's actually a nice segue to talk about Christian nationalism in the US context, because I think we are seeing some very unprecedented and troubling trends with respect to the promotion of political violence here in this country, with respect to really heightening sort of language that is trying to clearly make distinctions between in-groups and out-groups, and the out-groups being, of course, religious minorities and often people of color and other marginalized groups in society. And so if we could just take maybe 4 minutes to look at a couple of slides I put together. Here at PRRI, what we do is we collect lots of data. We interview thousands and thousands of people annually to kind of get a sense of what Americans are thinking and looking at trends with respect to religion and politics. And so I'm going to just share a few slides with respect to our work on Christian nationalism. as a way to sort of conclude this part of the conversation. So one of the things that we've been really chronicling, especially since the events of January 6th and the attempted insurrection at the US Capitol, is the extent to which Americans are subscribing to Christian nationalist ideology. And so this data comes from our American Values Atlas. I encourage folks to go online and to look at this data. You can kind of play around with it and get a better sense of all the information that we have available on this topic and many others. But in terms of measuring Christian nationalism, in the last year, we interviewed more than 20,000 Americans about their attitudes on a variety of issues that I think can be linked to what we call the propensity to hold Christian nationalist views. And so we ask Americans the extent to which they agree that gods have called Christians to exercise dominion over areas of society, the extent to which Americans think that we should declare America a Christian nation, that identity in terms of being an American is linked to being a Christian, and all of these sorts of things. And so our scale is one that is multifaceted. And what we do is we take those answers to those questions, and among Americans who strongly agree with all those 5 tenets, we classify them as being adherents of Christian nationalist ideology. So roughly 1 in 10 Americans agree with these notions of Christian nationalism. We also find, though, an additional 20% of Americans are sympathetic to those views. They might not strongly agree with all of the questions that you saw earlier, but there is a propensity to be largely sympathetic to those views. About 37% of Americans we categorize as completely rejecting those statements that you saw a little bit earlier. And so an additional 30% are very, very skeptical of most of those statements that we ask Americans to respond to. As you might not be surprised to learn, there's certainly clearly some partisan elements of who is likely to espouse Christian nationalist views. Republicans are 3 times as likely as Democrats to be either adherents to or sympathetic to Christian nationalist views. Views of Trump also are linked pretty strongly to propensity to adopt Christian nationalist views as well. One of the things that's unique about our data here is with more than 20,000 interviews being conducted last year, we're able to look at the relationship of Christian nationalism views within the 50 states compared to, for example, it's linked to percentage of Americans voting for Donald Trump. And here's a very clear sort of a correlation. You can kind of see almost a perfect correlation statistically as average scores on the Christian nationalism scale increase in all of the 50 states. You also see that those were the states that were more likely to have voted for Donald Trump in 2020. So what does this mean with respect to democracy and support for democracy? And this is getting back to some of Pratap's earlier points here on violence. One of the things that we've asked pretty consistently, and that's the last several years, is the extent to which Americans, if you look at the right hand of your screen, say that because things have gotten so far off track, true patriots might have to resort to violence. Now, 19% of Americans nationally last year agreed with that sentiment. That's pretty troubling in and of itself, but clearly Christian nationalist adherents are more than twice as likely to agree with that statement. On the left part of the screen, this is a question that really gets more into thinking in terms of the apocalypse. And one of these, we use this question to measure QAnon as well, American propensity to adopt QAnon theories. And so 54% of Christian nationalist adherents, an additional 45% of sympathizers believe that a storm is coming that will sweep away elites in power. So there is sort of a religious imagery with respect to Christian nationalism we see in our data. And last but not least, just to share one other data point, we routinely ask Americans about their support for pluralism, religious pluralism in this country. And we asked Americans last year in a survey whether or not they would largely prefer the US to be a nation made up of a variety of people belonging to a wide variety of religions, or would they rather essentially prefer the US to be a Christian nation. And it's very clear that Christian nationalists are far more likely to say that the US should really be home to Christians by and large, primarily, versus most Americans who actually advocate for and believe that we should be a nation that belongs to a wide variety of religions. And so I just was curious as to David and Pratap's views on some of the findings that we have here at PRRI and what they think their studies of other comparative examples in terms of nationalism and its growing threat to democracy, how does it speak to what's happening in the US, or is the US context something that is unique with respect to challenges of democracy and the role of religion in challenging democracy?
Okay. No, I mean, these are fascinating, even if a little bit disturbing findings. So I think, so there are obviously a couple of common themes that jump out, right? I think one, the sense that Christian nationalists have that Christianity is beleaguered in some ways or the other, right? And I think the interesting question comparatively is diagnosing where this sense of being beleaguered comes from. It obviously clearly has a values dimension to it, that in a sense, somehow religious adherents feeling that they're living in a cultural environment where they can no longer control the kinds of values people live by or express. There's one element to it. Is there something else to it? I think that's the first thing that jumps out at me. I think that sense of being, I think, beleaguered. The second thing that jumps out, and this is again a big change we see in India as well, which is it used to be the case in Indian democracy. Maybe it'll change again with this election, we hope, but that actually religiosity or expressions of religiosity did not tell you practically anything about electoral behavior and voting behavior, right? Over the last 15 years, that began to change, that you actually, I mean, at least it's kind of the few studies that we have, Indian data isn't as good in some ways, but that actually expressions of religiosity began to be more correlated with support for the BJP, right? In some ways. So in a sense, that partisan identification and the identification of religion with particular party political projects actually going stronger. So those are the two obvious things that kind of jump out at me, but David, I'm sure, has more things to add.
Sure. Well, just briefly, Melissa, it actually really resonates with some of the trends that I try to document in this book on religion in the State Department and sort of Trump foreign policy that I have coming out in a bit. This kind of two-faced attitude towards existing institutions, right? On the one hand, a sense that institutions should be under our control, right? And so when that's possible, a willingness to actually use those institutions, right, from time to time. But also when institutions are not functioning as they should be, a willingness to either disregard them or even kind of actively confront them, right? And potentially even with violence, right? And I think that resonates with some of what we saw, for instance, in religion and Trump administration foreign policy. On the one hand, there were times actually where the Trump foreign policy bureaucracy seemed to really sort of work with religion quite closely. Think about the ministerials on international religious freedom, right? Those were large bureaucratized events. That was not an anti-institutional moment. That was a moment when the organs of the state were acting as they should be, quote unquote, right? But at the same time, in instances where elements of the alleged deep state were not behaving as they should be, turn against it quite actively, right? And even receive kind of moral endorsement in that from some of the religious kind of loyalists around the Trump administration, right? We saw very supportive statements, for instance, of Trump in some of the classified documents investigations, not just from his political loyalists, but from his Christian nationalist loyalists, right? And so I think that really resonates with that sort of two-faced attitude towards how you confront existing American institutions that you guys are seeing in some of that data.
Yeah, I think those are all really, really good points, and I'm really excited to read what your book has to say. But clearly, I think with Christian nationalism as a threat, it's really in the Trump administration and the Trump campaign, disregarding any sort of free and fair election if it doesn't really suit the results that they're looking for. I mean, that's really, I think, one of the biggest threats that we're facing in 2024. And clearly, I think the Trump campaign and many, Republican leaders have already said that if the election is not won, it's going to be disregarded, right? That is a pretty alarming state of affairs, certainly. So we have just a few minutes left, about 5 minutes. And so a couple of questions to get to and maybe some final thoughts from both of our panelists here. And I know that Molly wanted to kind of summarize a few things for us at the very end. So to what degree, we have one question, do you see modern religious institutions serving as incubators for learning about democratic decision-making, governance, and leadership? So either Pratap or David, to what degree do you see modern religious institutions serving as incubators for learning democratic decision-making or governance? I'm thinking, of course, that it gets back to the very classic Putnam sorts of arguments.
Tocquevillian,
churches,
right? Does the Tocquevillian
right.
Putnam argument still operate, right? So, a very concrete example of this would be domestic citizen election monitoring in the Philippines, right? Mostly done by a group called the Parish Pastoral Council for Responsible Voting. This group mobilizes hundreds of thousands of citizen election observers in national elections, mostly through religious congregations, right? They're organized by congregations, they're trained in congregations, and then they are deployed to polling stations. This is the kind of classic Tocquevillian argument, I think, right? About learning citizenship in our local community associations, which may often be religious in nature. I guess the question I would have is whether those kinds of citizen initiatives are capable of pivoting away from kind of the electoral procedures of democracy to some of the more diffuse threats to democracy that we're facing, like undermining of judicial independence, right? Or efforts to revise constitutions, right? And I think there maybe the evidence is, or the jury is still out. But absolutely, a lot of that work goes on at the grassroots in the Philippine context, and I think elsewhere for sure. Yeah.
So if I can just add a couple of thoughts to that, right? So there are two ways in which you can actually think of certain kinds of religious politics and religious mobilization helping the cause of democracy. I mean, historically, religions have been a great source of social reform. Think of the abolitionist movement. In India, there have been religious-based movements against caste, which is still, I think, one could argue probably India's biggest structural challenge in some ways, right? So there are at least forms of religious movements that can actually produce egalitarian mores or more egalitarian mores that are actually more compatible with democracy. I think that's there. The place where I see the tension the most is actually the tension between freedom and religion. So you can get a lot of mobilizational energy in religious groups. Actually, in many societies, because religious groups are the only social spaces women are allowed, they're actually great sites of kind of their sort of publicness in some ways, in other ways they might not be allowed. So there are certainly all kinds of democratic agency that different sites of religion can actually mobilize. I think the place where I am a little bit wary is when it comes to saying, okay, will this mobilizational energy stand in the service or cause of individual freedom? Because it can actually easily be turned in some senses, also to suppress kind of difference and individual freedom. So I think it's the tension between, freedom and political agency that I think comes out a lot more in this mobilization, which is quite compatible with saying that they are also the source of, incredible virtues of a different kind.
Well, I think we're going to have that be the last word. This hour has certainly flown by. We had a couple of other questions, unfortunately, we couldn't get to, but I would encourage the questioners to please look at the research that David, Pratap, that are doing now. Look at our website at PRRI. We have all kinds of data in the US context about the growing threats of Christian nationalism in the US. And I wanted to turn it over to Molly for some final thoughts before we end.
Great. Thank you so much, Melissa. So I just would like to first thank the panelists, Melissa Deckman, Pratap Bhanu Mehta, David Buckley, for being here and sharing their valuable insights with us. I'd also like to thank again the Luce Foundation for funding the Intersections platform and just want to remind everyone that to please visit the Intersections website, and where we hope to have more information about this topic and about other topics in the religion and the public sphere, kind of broader world. So again, thank you so much. And so we'll close it out now. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.